Good afternoon. I'm Warwick Saban, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF Digital Discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. And today we'll turn our attention to higher education, and specifically to the multiple challenges faced by institutions, administrators, professors, and students. Things were hard enough before the pandemic struck, with student debt mounting and calls for free college increasing. Now the pandemic appears to be forcing a reckoning, and perhaps there's an opportunity to solve persistent problems. To help us explore these issues, we're fortunate to have Paul Tuff and Ruth Simmons with us today. Paul approaches educational issues through his writing, and he's the author of several best-selling books, including most recently, The Years That Matter Most: How College Makes or Breaks Us. He's also a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, and he's had pieces published in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, GQ, and Esquire. And Dr. Simmons is president of Prairie View A&M University in Texas, and before that, she served as president of Brown University from 2001 to 2012. Her entire career has been spent in higher education as a professor and administrator at the University of Southern California, Princeton University, and Spelman College before becoming president of Smith College. And she's received many awards, including the Fulbright Lifetime Achievement Medal and the Centennial Medal from Harvard University. And she serves on the boards of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Holdsworth Center. And as with all of our SOF digital discussions, Paul and Dr. Simmons will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation. And you could submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems at all during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So Paul and Dr. Simmons will be in conversation for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Ruth Simmons. Ruth?
Org, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you for what I hope will be a fruitful exchange about a subject of particular importance today, and that is education. Who loses, who benefits, and what we should do to address disparate outcomes. Paul, hello.
Hello.
As we begin this conversation about the state of education post-COVID-19, you've written a good deal about the power of grit, curiosity, and character to overcome economic and social disadvantage. Tell us about your own journey to discovering how important these traits are to positive behavior and success among youth.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Ruth, so much for doing these and for these questions. Thanks to the Society of Fellows. So to answer your question, my journey in the land of grit started a little more than a decade ago when two things happened at the same time. The first was that my wife and I had our first child. Our son Ellington is now 11. And as many of you have experienced, that just sort of exposes a new parent to all sorts of questions, and some panicky ones, some more thoughtful about what is going on in that little life and what's going to be important to him growing up. At the same time, I was doing some reporting. It was the very beginning reporting of what became my book, How Children Succeed. And in particular, I was spending time with an economist at the University of Chicago named James Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who was making a study of what he called non-cognitive skills. Good economics language for what the rest of us often refer to as character strengths. Things like grit and curiosity, perseverance, conscientiousness. And what he was finding in lots of long-term studies was that those skills, when you can measure them in young people, seemed to be more predictive of long-term success than the kind of IQ skills, the sort of cognitive skills that get measured on standardized tests. And this was news to a lot of people. The conventional wisdom in education was that the power of IQ scores was more important than anything else, that it outweighed anything else. And he was discovering something that was quite different. that led me into some reporting with individual educators, some at the KIPP charter schools. I spent time following a chess teacher in Brooklyn named Elizabeth Spiegel. Spent time with some high school students in Chicago working with a program called One Goal to try to get to college. And what I found was that sort of coincidentally, without there being a lot of communication between these different institutions, there was this growing sense that there was something going on that IQ scores, the standardized test scores, weren't capturing, that there was potentially a way to help young people, and especially young people growing up in difficult circumstances, succeed that we hadn't been tapping into.
Wonderful. Well, of course, you consulted a good many social scientists and economists in an effort to understand the landscape and the value proposition of American higher education. In reporting the findings of various studies and social science observations, you found a way to populate your books with young people who tell their own incredibly powerful stories alongside the data. It somehow makes it feel so compelling when we hear it from them. Which most aroused your interest in writing about education, the individuals and their compelling stories, or the evidence that awoke you to insights about what was motivating these students to achieve?
Well, I don't want to dodge your very good question, but the answer really is both. When I read nonfiction, long form nonfiction, I find that if I'm reading just a book of sort of data and economics, like there can be really useful insights, but it's hard to feel sort of emotionally engaged with it. And when I'm reading, even fantastic reporting that looks at, say, one family over time and how they change, but doesn't give me the sort of extra perspective and context of how their story fits into broader trends and pictures, I don't feel totally satisfied. I feel like I've got more questions. And so in all my reporting, I'm always trying to do both things at once, talking to economists and social scientists, but at the same time, talking to individual students. And for me, it helps me write these stories, but it also just helps me understand it, to be going back and forth. So for instance, when I was in the years that matter most, I profiled this one student at the University of Texas named Yvonne Martinez as she made her way through her freshman calculus course with a professor named Uri Treisman. And Yvonne was this fascinating character to me. She had grown up in pretty difficult circumstances on the west side of San Antonio. She was immigrated when she was a little girl from Mexico, started off not speaking any English, did fantastically well in school, and ended up at the top of her class. This is the salutatorian of her high school class. But her standardized test scores were not great. She had ACT scores of 22 or 23, but because of the way the University of Texas works, she got in, and she got into this challenging calculus class. And there's this big debate out there about whether a student like that with very high grades and only middle of the road test scores can succeed at a rigorous, demanding university like UT. So I found myself, just loving talking to Yvonne about her own experience, but at the same time wanting to understand this bigger perspective. And being able to do both those things at the same time, I think, just enriched my experience, and I hope enriched that chapter.
Well, indeed it does. And it really teaches me as a university president to find ways to make my students come alive to people when I'm talking about their needs and their aspirations and their possibilities. So thank you for doing that so well.
Thank you.
You've written about the problem of a rigid social hierarchy and the importance of young people being able to, quote, move beyond the circumstances of their birth. How close are we today as a country to the recognition of what must be done to empower children of poverty to do just that?
Well, it's a great question. I think that we are getting closer to the recognition of what to do and how big the problems are. The question for me, I think, is more of a political one, which is how much will we have to change things? And I think that's going to become especially relevant next year as we start talking about policy again instead of politics, and try to figure out what role we want to play in leveling that playing field. So in my most recent book was about college, but I've written in previous books a lot about early childhood. And we now know a ton about how important early childhood is in the success of children. Not only pre-K, which is really important and works better when it's universally available, but before pre-K, that when you can intervene, especially in families that are don't have a lot of money, that don't have a lot of stability, when you can intervene and support those parents in the first 3 years of a child's life, you can have enormous effects on how those children do. And yet we do not invest much in those years. We do not invest much in early childhood at all. The United States, I think, is at the bottom of the OECD countries in terms of how much we invest in early childhood. So again, it's a question where we know a lot about what could make things better. We are not investing as if we know those answers. And I think the same thing is true. The evidence shows that the same thing is true in adolescence, that at the end of high school and the beginning of college, there's another opportunity where young people are once again more malleable, where well-timed interventions to create a sense of belonging and possibility in young people can have outsized effects on how likely they are to graduate from high school, to go to college, and to succeed at college. And yet, for the most part, we are not investing in those programs. Higher education continues to be very unequal. And my sense so far is that we are not showing the political will to level that playing field. So the good news is we know how to do that if we decide that that's our national priority. The bad news is we're not doing it yet.
Indeed. You talked about the unique circumstances of children of want. And you point in your writing to the effect of trauma on these young people. So today we have a trifecta of COVID-19, incredible economic instability and loss, and then social unrest. The three presenting an unusual confluence of potentially traumatic factors for young people like the ones that we serve at Prairie View. Given your emphasis on the impact of trauma and stress on young people's prospects for success, what do you think will be the educational outcomes following this unique period of time?
It's a great question, and I think about it a lot. I spent the summer reporting an article for the New York Times Magazine, talking to students at one high school in Queens, a low-income high school with a lot of a high immigrant population. The students who were graduating, who just graduated in the spring, and talking with them about their college plans. And one thing that struck me talking to them is that certainly COVID was a huge disruption in their life and was having lots of negative effects. It didn't seem for a lot of them to be truly traumatic, and so I don't want to I want to be cautious in saying that, because I certainly think that there are people who are losing loved ones, who are experiencing homelessness, who are experiencing job loss, for whom there can be real traumas in COVID-19. But what struck me about some of these families is that despite the fact that it was hurting them economically, there were families that were going to food pantries for the first time. They were also all under one roof for the first time and not running around and having hectic lives. And so for some of these teenagers, they were like, yeah, it's been rough, but it's been kind of nice at the same time to have my family all here. What I worry about much more is just the simple disparities in learning loss. The fact that there's lots of evidence emerging that how much time students are spending on school, on learning, that the gaps in that are just increasing. That low-income students are not able to make remote learning work in the same way that students with lots of resources are, and that is driving this big gap. And there's clear evidence that that's going to lead to problems immediately and down the road, whether we're talking about kindergarten students or college students. The one other thing that I'll add to that question, I was just reading this paper that I found really interesting. So you were talking about social unrest. this is a paper that just came out from a Harvard economist this summer named Desmond Ang. And he found that for Black and Latino students, police being anywhere near a police-involved shooting had what he was able to measure the effect that that had on students, high school students, GPAs, their likelihood of graduating from high school, and their likelihood of going to college. And had an immediate downward effect on all three of those things. And it was an amazing use of data that he was able to show that for white and Asian students, being near a police-involved shooting did not change their outcomes. For Black and Latino students, it did. And that to me points to the power of trauma, that for Black and Latino students especially, being around that kind of violence has an intense emotional and physical effect on them. And we can now see its effect on learning as well.
Well, there certainly is a bit of uncertainty among young people about what the future might hold for them, given all these factors. What would you say would be a way for educators in this environment to reassure students that there will be opportunities for them in the future? How would you, as an educator, intervene with students who are fearful about the future?
I mean, what I take out of the psychological research about trauma and just even more broadly about education is that really what young people want and need the most when they're in difficult circumstances is someone to be there for them, just someone to talk to. And you know, certainly there are better and worse things that we can say to our kids and to the kids that we're mentoring and educating. But being present and listening and empathizing, those have a huge effect. You know, so much of the effect of mentoring is not about, you know, making the right connections and, you know, helping with the resume, though those things can certainly help. So much of it is just the sort of psychological fact of being a stable, non-threatening, supportive presence in a young person's life at a moment where they don't have enough of that. So that's what I would say to educators, to parents, to mentors who are working with young people who are affected by this. That certainly there are lots of positive things we can say. There's lots of concrete help that we can give, but simply being involved and engaged and empathetic, I think, matters more than anything else.
Okay. Let's go back to the digital divide, and I would certainly agree with you that we've certainly heard testimonials from many students about how difficult the online environment is for them. But let's think about the other aspect of it, and that is the complaints about the high cost of education, which prevents so many students from going on to higher education. Are there not opportunities to reduce the cost of education by utilizing this technological support?
There might be. I hope there are. So I just feel like we've got to look at both those things at the same time. I do want to be optimistic and thoughtful about whether there are ways to save money and to make education more efficient. But there is such a risk as we do that of deepening that digital divide that I think we've got to be really, really cautious about it. So the place in the higher education landscape that I feel most optimistic about in terms of remote learning is what's happening at Southern New Hampshire University, where the president, who's named Paul LeBlanc, has been making great strides, I think, in the last decade or so in creating an inexpensive and effective online program. And right now, it's mostly most of its students are post-traditional college age. It's people in their late 20s and 30s. And those are, highly motivated students who have hit a certain point in their careers where they know exactly what they need from education, and they want a program that is flexible and reasonably priced, where they can get exactly the credential that they need. Southern New Hampshire also has this program called College for America that is aimed at younger students. And I experienced it through this program in Austin, Texas, where I live most of the time, called Peloton University, or Peloton U. And Peloton U combines the online approach of Southern New Hampshire University with an in-person mentoring approach. So there's actually a storefront in North Austin where you go if you're a Peloton U student, and you hang out for 10 or 12 hours a week, and you do your online lessons at Southern New Hampshire. And you have there a mentor, an advisor, a sense of community, other students who are around you, who give you a bit of that college experience, a bit of the support that you need. And that to me feels like the closest thing that I've seen to the right balance between the flexibility and low cost of online education with the in-person sense of belonging and connectedness that we know that every student needs, but especially younger students, college-age students, and especially those who don't, our first generation, don't come from a family where there's lots of college. I think if we ignore that side, if we just say like, let's just put the tools out there, and the people who are ready for them will grab them, I think it's not going to work, and I think we're going to deepen that divide.
So when I think about that university and the various new options that have arisen for students, I go back to your concern about what you call the meritocratic machine that higher education in this country is. What would you most like to see done to mitigate the harmful effects of this machine? And let me say that one of the issues with innovation, of course, in education is that it takes quite a while for the public to begin to acknowledge the value of that innovation, because they continue to reify the centuries-old institutions that make up that meritocratic ideal. What would you most like to see to hasten the day when students will be able to choose the kind of education that suits them best, and not be punished for it because they didn't go to the so-called right school?
Well, so my process of writing this book, I spent 6 years reporting this book, and the years that matter most. And part of what happened, I'm actually just been writing the afterword for the paperback edition that's coming out in March, and so I've been thinking about this a lot. What was I doing for all those years? And one thing that I've come to understand is that I started this process, sort of looking at the kind of programs that I looked at in my previous books, like small interventions that could change the behavior and the thinking and the psychology of students, and make them more likely to apply to the schools they should apply to, or attend, actually show up and to the first day of school, or persist once they get there. And I do think that there are lots of important programs that I wrote about, and others that I didn't, that can make a difference and can really help improve graduation rates, level the playing field in admissions. But at the same time, I was really kind of overwhelmed by how many of the problems are not sort of small and psychological. They are big and economic and structural. And that the biggest, it really has to do with public funding of public higher education. So I've was going back to write this afterward, back into the data, and it's amazing. So in 1975, the cost of a year in-state tuition and fees for the average American at a 4-year public institution was $525, and in current dollars, that's $2,500. And so you could, if you had a minimum wage job for the summer, you could afford your full college and tuition and fees, right? And so now we say, well, it's so much more expensive. How can students possibly afford it? But we know exactly why it's more expensive. It's not more expensive for any reason other than back then it was, it was still the same sorts of costs to get an education, but the public was paying for it, right? So we have cut in half public funding for public higher education since 1980. And all that has done is transferred that cost onto the backs of students instead of on the part of the public. And that's not the way we used to do it in this country. That's not the way historically that public public higher education has been funded. It's not the way that public higher education is funded in any other country or in any other successful developed country in the world. And it has just been this experiment in the privatization of public higher education that we've been doing for the last 40 years that has, I think we can now say, been really unsuccessful. And it's just a political choice. It is not something that we don't have control over. We have incredible control over it. It's in the control of voters and taxpayers and legislators. So that is the one thing that I would change, which I would reorient public higher education so that it is, if not free, very cheap, much more accessible, much better funded. And that I think that would not only provide much more opportunity for many students, it would also level not just the playing field for students, but the playing field for institutions. So right now there is such a disparity, not only among students, but among institutions. There are institutions that have enormous resources and institutions that have very few resources. And if there was better public funding of public higher education, that landscape would get a lot flatter. It would mean that for students, applying to college would be much less stressful because there wouldn't be a limited number of high quality seats. And I think it would create a world in which going to college was less stressful, more positive as an experience for individual students. But it would also produce many more successful college graduates. It would help our economy in a huge way.
Great. I'm going to ask you a somewhat unfair question.
Great.
Maybe about a sector that you don't know as much about, and that is for a good long while in this country, HBCUs, more recently MSIs, have afforded opportunities, the kind of opportunities that you call for, instilling character, grit, and ambition, and preventing graduates from their institutions from entering the world without being completely lost, as you say. They've also afforded students immense social mobility. What lessons might they offer for the meritocratic machine?
So you're right. I don't know as much about historically Black colleges and universities as I should, and as I do about other institutions. But here's my guess, and you can tell me whether you think, president of one, you can tell me if it holds up or not. So when we were talking about online education, the thing that strikes me about it is that there are really two things happening in a college experience for most young students. And one is they're gaining skills and knowledge that are going to serve them in the workplace. And the other is that they're experiencing some kind of identity formation, right? They're coming to understand who they are. And I think one of the problems with emphasizing online higher education too much is that it's really hard to have that part of the experience when you're studying online, right? And I think that's the key to why HBCUs tend to punch above their weight. I mean, the other thing that I'm guessing you can support me on is that HBCUs are mostly not funded well enough, including public ones. And so I think, as a result, they often have to compete for the top students. But the students who attend, again, they punch above their weight. They do better than would be predicted. And I think that's because there is, especially for Black students, there is such a sense of identity formation and belonging that happens on those campuses. So the main place that I get that feeling from is in Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, where he talks about showing up on the campus of Howard University in this rapturous prose that makes it seem like heaven on earth. And I think it was for him, and it was the place that he felt at home with other highly intelligent African-American students and felt this sense of belonging and purpose. And the research is clear that actually matters, right? That does a huge amount to creating a success in young people. And so that's what I think the rest of us can take away from it, that we should be investing much more in our historically Black colleges and universities. But even with the investment that we're making now, we can see how important that sense of identity is. And I think that's certainly true for Black and Latino students at non-minority serving institutions, who often don't get that sense of belonging and often get quite the opposite. But I think it's true for every student too. I think every student, especially first generation students, but every student needs that sense of belonging on campus. And there's a lot more that institutions can do to create it.
So for first generation students, I'm often asked by boards of trustees and others, what can be done to help those students with identity creation on mostly white campuses? Do you have any thoughts about what they could do?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that that's one place that a lot of institutions are making great strides, especially the most selective institutions. So I've spent a few years going to conferences by this organization called IVG, or First Generation Ivy, and I think it's just really in the past 6 or 7 years that first generation students at those highly selective institutions are coming to experience that as a point of pride, as something that they feel is their identity and they feel proud of and not ashamed of. I think that's a lot of that is just organic, is students finding each other and organizing themselves. I think colleges are doing a better job than they used to in making those students feel at home. But I think there's still a lot that they can do. I mean, it's sort of not rocket science, right? It's really just about making someone feel at home, not creating sort of messages in the way you communicate with students that tends to isolate those students, make them feel like outsiders, exclude them. It's not that hard, I think, to make them feel included and part of the team.
Maybe if it were rocket science, we would have made more.
That's true. You're good at rocket science. I forgot.
I often say when I went off to college many decades ago, I couldn't have imagined that we would be seeking the same solution so many decades later. It is a very, very challenging space to work in and to solve problems in. But the rewards, when you do solve those problems, as you point out by highlighting some of the wonderful achievements of the students that you studied, it's amazing in a country like ours that students can go from the most challenging circumstances to immense success in their lives because we take care to think about how to improve these institutions. So thank you very, very much for all of your insights. Any final words that you'd like to add? What are you dying for us to know?
No, I always have more things I want to say, but no, I'm first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for that great conversation. But I'm hoping we have some questions from the audience, and I'd love to take those on.
Absolutely.
Well, tell us.
We do indeed, and thank you both. It's been a terrific discussion so far. We do have some questions in from the audience. I want to remind those of you who also would like to submit a question that if you just click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can type it in and we will try to get to it. The first question I'm going to read, obviously both of you can take a stab at it. It's interesting because it's a little bit off the path of what you were discussing, but this person asks, with so many college students taking time off, and that's in quotation marks, due to COVID, should we be working toward a year of service, an AmeriCorps type program to redirect the energy and skills to help in so many sectors that seem to be in need, especially in the public education field?
Paul?
Yes, I think we should. I mean, it's a hard year in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways that it's hard is that for those students who are looking for an alternative to college, it's a hard time to do service, right? It's a hard time to go into public schools. But at the same time, there's a lot of need. And so, I feel like the idea of public service is one that we, places like the Aspen Institute have been talking about for a long time, and there doesn't seem to be the political will to make it happen. But I think this is an opportunity. It's a moment where, there are a lot of students who, for whom this is not the right year to be in college. And if we can find something more productive for them to do, I think it would benefit them and benefit us. Ruth, any thoughts on that?
I would simply echo that. I think even with the students who are in college, and I hear it every day from my students, they're in college, but they are so desirous of getting out there and doing something. Because I don't remember a time in my career when students have been so frustrated with what they perceive to be the lack of social progress. And they can hardly wait to immerse themselves in trying to find solutions, which is very, I must say, inspiring as an educator to be in this time working with students who are driven to do something significant to contribute to society. So I think it'd be wonderful to have those alternatives. And you give me an idea, in fact, for something that we might try to do in the spring with our students, to give them more options for being able to mix their study with this kind of activity.
Great idea.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Randy Lipton, and he asks, when you talk about leveling the playing field with respect to the cost of higher education, do you see a way to include private colleges and universities in this, or just public institutions? And if the latter, what are your thoughts on private institutions maintaining nonprofit status?
Good question. So I'm not sure if I can answer that very last part. I might leave that to Ruth. I think, I mean, I'm focused mostly on public institutions right now because I feel like that's where we have the most levers, right? As the public, and that was always the place where the public invested, and that was always the cheap option, and it should be again. I don't know exactly what would happen with private higher education if public higher education became much better supported by the public. My guess is that it would push down costs as well, simply because there would be a whole different cost structure. I think there are some students, some families who are going to want to spend a ton on a certain type of education, and so those institutions are always going to exist. But I think better funded public institutions would just change the landscape. It would create so many other options for young people that it would force those private institutions to change. What that does to their nonprofit status, I don't think it affects them. I mean, I think there's a place for private higher education. I think it can continue to function. It can continue to be an option. I just want students to have many other cheaper, better options as well.
No, I certainly agree with that. Although I think in this country, again, this goes back for centuries. The elitism of higher education is a major factor, and I know I've counseled students over the years who wanted to go to very pricey universities. But given their interests, they really didn't need to do that, and their parents didn't have to sacrifice. But I could not convince the students or the parents because the name of these institutions, these so-called elite institutions, now so pervasive in terms of an assumption of quality, that people who are aspiring to social mobility just believe that that's their ticket to a different life, and so it's very hard to convince them of difference. And in terms of cost, look, I've said frequently that higher education doesn't have to be as expensive as it is. We have a lot of curlicues in higher education, things that we have nothing whatsoever to do with education, things that we've become accustomed to. And so we want to offer all of these things, but every time we offer a climbing wall, every time we offer some very distinctive feature, we're putting it into the pricing.
Right.
So I think we have got, when I was the Ivy League president, I tried to persuade my colleagues that we should focus on this issue and try to address it. But nobody's really interested in addressing that. If you have enough money to build, 10 climbing walls, you're not interested in it. And as soon as you do that, all of the other universities want to follow you, and they build climbing walls too. So I think it's the arms race for sure. And we have to get ourselves out of that mentality if we're going to be able to serve the public better.
Well, on the private side, interestingly, it seems like, some of that is sorting itself out because there's some, smaller liberal arts colleges that, are really struggling financially, I think, because of the very factors you just mentioned. I wanted to ask you, as a former state legislator, I know we didn't talk about this before the event, but, I had to vote on budgets, obviously a huge supporter of higher ed and public funding. But one of the challenges that I found, and I'm kind of curious your opinion about this, is that there's so many public institutions of higher education now. It seemed like almost too many, so that you couldn't fund any of them adequately or really fairly. And by the way, I was a state legislator in Arkansas, which is a small state, only 3 million people, but we had, dozens of community colleges and four-year institutions. And curious, like, would part of solving the problem maybe be some consolidation, which I can tell you is hard politically, because everybody wants to keep their institution. But is that part of what's happened, is we've stretched the dough too thin and we can't deliver on the promise of a public higher education at the level of quality that we should?
Well, Ruth, I'll let you take that one on, I'll start by just saying that I tend to think that I don't think that is the problem. I mean, I in my book I look back at this era 100 years ago called the high school movement that I wasn't aware of this history until I started working on this book, where American communities all over the country, starting in around 1910, realized that there were changes in technology that meant that their young people, who were mostly stopping school at grade 6 or after 6th grade or 8th grade, needed more education. And so those communities came together and they started building high schools and making them free, raising their taxes, contributing to this. And suddenly every community in the country had a high school. And now it's 100 years later, and students need more than a high school education. They certainly need at least 2 years more and probably 4 years more in order to have the same standard of living that those students had 100 years ago, right? To be able to have a middle-class life. And so I think it's like saying there's too many high schools, right? I think we need lots of institutions because we need lots of opportunity. It's very hard to make your way in the world right now without some kind of credential or degree after high school. It's just what's different between now and 100 years ago is that instead of deciding we're all going to invest in those institutions and make them free, we are deciding to create a free market in which students not only have to pay for them, but they have to figure it out and decide what the right discount is. And we've made it both expensive and complicated, in other words. So to my mind, that's what we've really got to solve.
So, I certainly agree. I don't think we have enough universities. So here's the thing: for legislators and policymakers, have to be really smart about what is happening within higher education. Okay, so after World War II, and the country began to build technology and got into a race for the competition with other nations for intellectual property. Universities were incentivized to do research. And guess what happened? We used to have a perfectly wonderful variety in state institutions, where some state institutions were actually teaching institutions. And you could go to them and get a good degree, and it was perfectly fine. But look at most state systems now, and you will see what was formerly a teaching institution is now aspiring to be a research institution to compete for those dollars. And that means that when they do that, it's a much more expensive venture than if they had retained their previous mission. So every university is now trying to compete in that netherworld. And we don't need that. We don't need every university to be a university pursuing original research. And so I've often said, if we could get back to the model that we had before, which is good, serviceable institutions really doing an outstanding teaching role, that would really be a better scenario, because we'd have more money to invest in education if we did that. And keep in mind, in the United States, the lines are pretty porous. You can go to a Cal State Dominguez Hill and go all the way to Stanford when you finish. So your opportunity is not blocked because you went to a state college. You still get to aspire to other institutions that are more research intensive. So I think that's what the problem is. It's every institution trying to be the same type of university.
Terrific. And last question for both of you, and we'll try to make it quick because technically over time, but
Okay.
should community college be free? Can it be free?
Yes, and yes. There's my
Yes and
quick
yes. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a terrific discussion. As usual, we run out of time when we're with such terrific people discussing such important subjects, but I can't thank both of you enough for tackling this one. And we look forward to welcoming you back because I have a feeling we're going to want to continue to talk about this subject in the coming weeks and months. So thank you both.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Warwick.
Warwick.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. And thanks to our audience, to all of you members of the Society of Fellows for joining us this important discussion today. We'll be back with you very, very soon with another program as we head into the election. Hard to believe it's less than a month away. But in the meantime, be on the lookout for other Aspen Institute programming, including Aspen Ideas Show Up, and including our SOF community conversations that are coming up in your respective regions. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay well. We'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.